Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome back. This is part 2 of a history of safeguarding and child protection in the United Kingdom. And this is Safe State. I'm a child protection lawyer in the UK, and my goal here is to share knowledge and also to do it in a way that makes this topic as interesting as it can be. So I think on the last occasion we got to around 1982 was the last case that we looked at. So we'll start here today, 1984. Heidi Casida was 4 years old at the time of this case, and her mum was Rosemary Casida. Her stepfather was Nicholas Price. And in 1984, Heidi was starved to death in an unheated, locked back bedroom in Hillingdon in West London. And why, might you ask? Why was she treated that way? Well, it was as a punishment for stealing sweets. So her stepfather pretty much jailed her in a bedroom for stealing sweets. But not only did he do that, he also starved her. And so he was tried and found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. And her mother, Rosemary Casida, was found guilty of manslaughter. Now, she was detained in a high security psychiatric hospital. And this tragedy, this beautiful young girl, 4 years old, being killed by those who are supposed to care for her the most. This happened after a neighbour had heard Heidi crying for weeks. And had repeatedly complained to the NSPCC, as did Heidi's relatives, but unfortunately these weren't followed up on sufficiently enough, so the risk wasn't identified. Now, this incident happened in Hillingdon in London, which, as you can see, is marked in red here on this map. So we've got Greenwich Park over here, and then Richmond Park on this side, and then right in the middle of this map we've got kind of an area, it says Brixton there. Now, Hillingdon Council covers that area that's highlighted in red. And there was an inquiry undertaken that was chaired by a senior NSPCC inspector. And that inquiry found that the professionals in this case had failed to investigate a complaint of child abuse made by a neighbour. Now, that in itself is one thing. And I will back and support social workers in the sense that often we find that they are struggling with caseloads that are far too high. But this particular social worker didn't just fail to investigate it, they then tried to cover that up by making a fictitious account of a visit to see the child. Now, that to me is unforgivable, because that is the kind of misconduct that brings your profession into disrepute. It reflects badly on all other social workers, and it contributes towards this view that the general public has of social work professionals as being the enemy. Now, we have here, this is the house that Jasmine lived in with her family. That's 57 Kelsall Rise in northwest London, and that's covered by the London Borough of Brent as the local authority in question. And you can see here, I've identified on the map the area, and you can see here Wembley's marked on there, so many of you will be familiar with Wembley Stadium, and that's kind of just on the outskirts of the area in question. Now I just want to play you a little clip that is from Thames News at the time.
Little Jasmine Beckford suffered 10 months of cruelty and neglect that ended with her death. It was 3 or 4 heavy punches to the head that killed her, but her body was riddled with cuts and bruises, and she was partly deformed, the legacy of a series of horrific attacks. Attacks that apparently went unheeded by Brent social workers charged with her care, and by neighbours who told us they'd no idea anything was wrong till the day the police arrived. The girl's stepfather, Maurice Beckford, a former boxer, described by friends as popular and happy-go-lucky. At the scaffolding firm where he worked, half a mile from home, colleagues said he was a reliable employee. He was also renowned for his strength.
Yeah, he was a very strong fella. Strong fella. I see him sometimes putting on all him 3 of those 21 scabby too. I shook them off with Larry.
Did he ever show any sort of impatience or having a bad temper?
As I said, I never seen him no bad temper over there. We work together, I never seen him no bad temper.
Throughout the final 2 years of her life, Jasmine was in the care of Brent Council, and yet during the crucial last 10 months, social worker Gunn Wallstrom saw her just once. The court heard she'd been hoodwinked by the girl's parents. Brent have announced an independent inquiry, but don't they accept that their department made some appalling errors?
I'm not going to comment on the details of the case there because any comments I might make might prejudice the involved in the inquiry.
But do you agree with the evidence that emerged from court, that is, that your social workers were in fact hoodwinked by the parents?
I've not been in court, so I haven't heard the evidence that has been given in court at all, no.
But can the public be assured in the meantime that before this inquiry that a case like this won't happen again?
Of course, one cannot say categorically that a case like this will never happen again. But what we can say is that our procedures for dealing with these sort of cases are constantly under review.
The Brent inquiry will begin on April the 11th and take a month to report. This is the house in Kensal Rise where little
Next we've got Carl John McGoldrick. Carl was 3 years old and he lived in Newcastle, and Carl died as a result of child abuse. Now there's relatively little known about this case, but what we do know is that there was an inquiry by the Northern Regional Health Authority that was chaired by Professor Anderson, and that identified a number of serious shortcomings in the way that the case was handled, and it made a range of recommendations, the majority of which several significant improvements were made after the inquiry. And we have to remember that this is something that is avoidable. If we learn sufficiently from the incidents that happen, if we learn about which processes work and which don't, to a good enough level of self-reflection, we can make enough improvements that we can drastically limit the number of children that are impacted in the way that these children were. Apologies guys, I had to go and get some water. You're going to have to excuse the fact that I've got a really gravelly voice. It's currently May in the UK, and as with every May, my allergies are through the roof. So I sound like I smoke 50 packets of cigarettes a day, and I don't. I've never smoked, but very gravelly voice. So Doreen Mason, or Doreen Jane Mason to give her a full name. She was also known as Doreen Aston, which is stepdad's surname. She was born on the 22nd of May of 1986. So when this incident happened, she was just 16 months old. And she lived in Southwark with her mother, Christine Mason, who was only 23 at the time, and her mother's boyfriend, Roy Aston, who was 24. So we've got two, relatively young parents or carers. And Doreen had been on the Southwark risk register from the time that she was born. And her mum and Roy were, as unfortunately is all too often the case, quite openly hostile to professionals, in particular social workers. And that meant that during that 16-month period, Doreen was seen once, which wasn't enough to keep her safe. Prior to her life being cut so tragically short at 16 months of age, she slept on the floor, and the couple would just literally throw food on the floor to her, as you would for a pet, but not even in a bowl or on a plate, just thrown on the floor. And they both basically abused her throughout her short life. She was subjected to bruising, burns. She was immersed in water. At one point she was hung over a balcony and had her leg broken as a result of that. And her mum and Roy didn't bother to get any of her injuries treated. So on the 13th of September of 1987, Doreen succumbed to her injuries. Now both her mum and Roy were convicted of manslaughter and cruelty, and they were jailed for 12 years each, which seems, well, it doesn't seem like much justice at all, really, does it, that sentence? But what did we learn from it? Well, there was an inquiry, and that inquiry stated that Doreen's social worker was really quite inexperienced. Now, that in and of itself isn't a major issue. We all start somewhere. The problem was she was inexperienced and wasn't given the proper training and supervision, which meant that she wasn't able to handle the case with such openly hostile parents who were frustrating all her attempts to see Doreen and check that she was okay. The report also stated that Southwark Children's Social Care suffered from what they described as a siege mentality and destructive mistrust between professionals and between senior managers. So I think essentially they were working in quite challenging circumstances. You've got a young, inexperienced social worker and a department where you don't know which managers you can trust, and you're very much working as though you're kind of under fire constantly, as opposed to being able to proactively manage cases. And I'd like to say that we've learnt that lesson and that doesn't happen anymore, but that isn't true. It's remained a theme throughout all of the inquiries across the time that we're going to look at. Next, we've got Sakina Hammond, who was born on the 19th of September of 1983. This beautiful little girl was 5 years old when she lost her life on the 6th of December of 1988. Now, this isn't a picture of her that's on this slide. That is a stock image, because unfortunately I couldn't find one. And you'll see that throughout the slides I have referenced on the slide if it's a stock image. With these kind of quite historical cases, unfortunately there isn't always much to be found in the way of photographs. It was somewhat different back then compared to today's digital age, where everything's immortalised. Almost every second is immortalised, isn't it? On social media somewhere. So they lived in Avon in Somerset, and you can see here on the map I've kind of referenced the area here. And she lived with her mum, Patricia Kent, and her father, David Hammond. Now, Mr. Hammond was a martial arts expert, and that becomes relevant a little bit later on. And in March 1988, 9 months before Sakina died, her father had tied her mum to a chair and for many, many hours beaten her. And that incident, we're not talking a momentary loss of control here, we're talking hours of sustained torture. It was described in a case conference about Sakina really insipidly, so it was described, it literally just said domestic incident. And at that moment in time, things were treated a little bit differently in relation to domestic violence. So it's a huge priority for society and for the government to deal with the issues around domestic violence now. But back then that wasn't the case, and that domestic violence between mum and dad masked the dangers to Sakina's safety, because it was described in such a nondescript way that it wasn't clear quite what type of man David Hammond was. But on the 6th of December 1988, the world found out, because he took Sakina's life. And again, the first question that always enters my head is, why? Why would a parent, any parent, whether you are a natural parent, an adopted parent, a foster parent, why would you take the precious life of the child that you are supposed to love and care for? And the answer in this case might surprise you. In David Hammond's own words, it was because Sakina wouldn't spell her name in reward for sweets. You actually heard that right. She wouldn't spell her name. How did she have her life taken? Well, David Hammond, this martial arts expert, used violence against his daughter that included hitting her with his fists, a ruler. That was then followed by some plastic tubing, and then finally with a kettle flex. And as Sakina lay dying, she told her dad that she was sorry. There was evidence of at least 50 blows having been rained down on this little girl. Sakina's mum did try and intervene, but she just got punched in the face as a result. Now, after the incident, Sakina's dad, David Hammond, he admitted to losing control and beating Sakina until she lost her life. But he didn't then go on to plead guilty at trial because that would be sensible. Instead, what he decided to do was plead not guilty and force all of Sakina's family to relive the horror of what happened to her. So he was convicted of murder after trial, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And that happened at Bristol Crown Court. But alongside the criminal proceedings, there was an inquiry into the behaviour of professionals and how the case was handled. And it concluded that Children's Social Care made a mistake in removing Sakina from the at-risk register just months before her death. That was in August of 1987, and she'd been on the register at that point for 20 months, but then they concluded that things had improved and they removed her. And that was a multi-agency decision that was taken not just by the social worker on their own, but by Children's Social Care, the NSPCC, police and health. But the inquiry concluded that that decision to remove her, albeit it was a mistake, that didn't contribute to her death because there was nothing to indicate that he'd ever laid a hand on Sakina before. And you can't often, or you can't always predict when there's going to be this loss of control by a parent. So it concluded that the death could not have been reasonably foreseen. Children's Social Care had been involved for 3 years in total, and during that time 2 other children in the family had been injured, including having broken limbs. And then 3 weeks before her death, Sakina was examined by doctors after there was an anonymous call stating that Sakina had been beaten by her father, but there were no marks, and so they couldn't justify her removal from the home at that point. In 1985, Sakina had suffered a broken leg, and then in 1987 she suffered a broken arm, but again the doctors couldn't say whether or not that was an accidental injury or an inflicted injury, unfortunately. So where did that take us to? It took us to 1988, and one of probably the biggest practical improvements in child protection that's happened really, and that was that the government issued a piece of guidance called Working Together to Safeguard Children, and the whole premise of that guidance is relatively basic, albeit it's a big piece of guidance, and that is that everybody is responsible for keeping children safe, not just social workers, not just police officers, but all professionals, and in fact the whole of society really, are all responsible for keeping our children safe. And I think that that is a very, very appropriate and sensible way to look at it, because the old saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child, and I think it's true. And if we don't all look out for each other, then it's very difficult to try and kind of prevent these tragedies from occurring. So the idea is that all of the professionals who are involved in a child's life work together to make sure that they stay safe. And that includes, but it's not limited to, because as I say, this is a kind of a premise that covers the whole of society, but it includes as the kind of core members health, children's social care, police, schools, and school health. And it introduced what are now called serious case reviews. They used to be just case reviews at the time when they first came out, but it introduced that concept. And this guidance, it remains in force today. It's a living document, so it's reviewed on a regular basis and it's amended when required, but it remains the kind of core piece of guidance for professionals working with children. Now, some other things happened in 1988, and that includes the Cleveland inquiry, which the premise of that is that basically children aren't to be treated as objects, and that what should be at the heart of all dealings with children is the child's best interests. So we should be acting at all times in the best interests of the child in question. And it also concluded that parents should be treated with courtesy, made aware of their rights, and provided with support during the investigation process. And it provides for records to be kept centrally, training to be provided to professionals, and that professionals should be, again, going back to working together to safeguard children, similar concept, making decisions and doing assessments together. And there was a white paper before government at the time that was the Children Act, and it was concluded as part of the Cleveland inquiry that that act should be implemented. It also concluded that where a place of safety order is made, which would now be called an interim care order, so removing the child from their family, then a simple written explanation of what that order says should be given to the parents. And that all lawyers engaged in this type of work at all levels were to make themselves more fully aware of the nature of child abuse and its management. I think as lawyers, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect because we're not seeing those children on a day-to-day basis like the social workers are. We don't have that first-hand experience of what impact the various pieces of harm have on the child. So we need to kind of put a little bit of extra effort into understanding that side of things, whilst also relying on the professional judgment of the social workers who, you know, that's the area that they've trained in. And that children's social care, the police and medical professionals should work together to make all decisions about children, so they're kind of a multi-agency approach as opposed to one particular professional or service making a decision about the child on their own. And so that brings us to the Children Act, which is the act that created the current statutory framework for child protection in the UK, and it's still in force. I'm not going to kind of take you through the detail of the act. That I could spend like days talking about it. So what I will say is this, that it provided for a child's welfare to be the paramount consideration of the court when looking at any decision about a child's future. It also provided that a child's wishes and feelings should be given due regard, taking into account their age. That doesn't mean that the child gets to choose what happens to them, because a child doesn't always know, particularly when they've been in a harmful situation, what is in their best interests. But it does mean that the court will listen to what they've got to say and give it due regard when they're making the decision. And then we've got the case of Liam Johnson. So post Children Act, things were somewhat different. And Liam was born on the 1st of August of 1985 at Netheredge Hospital in Sheffield. And he lived with his father, Robert Johnson, and his father's girlfriend. And they lived in the borough of Islington in London. And Liam was 3 years of age when on the 25th of December 1987 his life was tragically cut short. On the 13th of June of 1989, his father was convicted of manslaughter after he essentially beat Liam until he lost his life. And his girlfriend later described that he was so powerful that when he smacked his sons, he sometimes knocked them off their feet. Imagine a grown man, and this little kid is 3 years old, and he's hitting him so hard that it's knocking him off his feet. There was a review undertaken by Islington Area Child Protection Committee after Liam's death, and it concluded that the extent of his father's violence towards several of his partners only became apparent after this incident. and so it was difficult to predict what might happen. It recommended that there be guidance published about when children's social care ought to divulge to a new partner information about violence towards previous partners or children of a previous relationship. And that's a really important change that occurred, because if you know prior to becoming involved with somebody that they've got a violent past, A, it might deter you, but B, if it doesn't, then you become culpable if something happens to your children, because you've willingly put them in that risky situation. I've just got a little map here that shows where Islington is, and that's where Liam lived with his family. So we've got Camden Town, which I'm sure many people will have heard of, and Hackney, where Hackney cabs became a thing. The next case is Daniel Vergowan. He lived with his mum Leonie, who was 31, and his stepfather Gerard Dowden, who was 29. And they lived on the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, so just down the road from the last case. And Daniel was 5 years old when tragically his life was taken. And on the night that his life was cut short, as his little body lay there, his mum and stepfather sat around chatting with their friends and smoking a cannabis bomb out of a coconut shell. I can't grasp that they would sit there just relaxing after it. Now, the stepfather, Dowden, had a previous drugs conviction, and Daniel had been on the child protection register for about 3 years prior to his death, because his mum had been arrested when he was 2 for allegedly punching him. Now, because of this children's social care involvement, mum became resentful really of the social workers, so she decided that they could only see him if either they visited him at nursery or they saw him on the balcony of the home, which should have been ringing out alarm bells, honestly. And then two months before this incident, the stepfather, Dowden, threatened to kill the social worker, and they responded appropriately. They set up a case conference to discuss what to do about it, but unfortunately only the social worker and a health visitor turned up, so they postponed it to September because it was school holidays and professionals weren't around, so they postponed it, thinking then everybody can attend and we can make a proper decision about what to do to protect Daniel. But they didn't get a chance, because on the 8th of September his life was taken. Now, his stepfather caused a hard blow to his abdomen that ruptured his stomach, His trunk and buttocks were covered in striped bruises from being beaten with a snooker cue. And his mum was convicted of child cruelty, spanning the 3-year period before his death. And Judge Brian Smedley jailed Dowden for murder, and that's a mandatory life sentence. But then he added on 4 years to run concurrently, so that's at the same time. So you have, when sentences are given, they either run consecutively, so one after the other, or they run concurrently, which is at the same time. This was concurrent. And an inquiry was undertaken, and Hackney Borough Council said that the social worker responsible for the case had acted properly and with care. The council's director of social services, who was Mr. Gordon Peters, said, striking the right balance between protecting children from violence and maintaining their right to a family life will never be an easy task. And he's right, it's not. But I think the balance was somewhat off in this particular case. He went on to say, whilst it could be said that with hindsight Daniel would not have died if he had been in care, he was confident that the social worker and her managers had acted with the greatest propriety, competence and judgment in light of the information that they had available to them at the time. I think I would have a slightly different view to that, because I think to postpone the case conference when there's a threat to life against an individual professional who's working on the case for any period of time is not appropriate, but to do it for, you know, a reasonably big period of time was one of those sliding doors moments where, had that case conference have been an effective meeting, decisions could very well have been taken that would have saved Daniel's life. And next we've got Sophie Merry. She was 3 when she passed away. She lived in Lewes in Chichester with her mum, who was Katie Merry, who was 23, and a stepfather, Kevin Strudwick, who was 29. And 4 months of abuse was suffered by Sophie after her mum moved into a very cramped caravan with her boyfriend at Selsley near Chichester in West Sussex. That relationship started whilst Katie's husband was on trial for murdering a young woman, and he was later jailed for life for that offence. So we've got mum and a husband. Husband goes on trial for murdering a young girl. Whilst that trial's happening, she then moves in with this next partner. And 2 weeks before Sophie lost her life, police were called by a concerned neighbour about the state of Sophie. And officers came to the property, but they accepted the story that Sophie's black eye was caused by her 4-year-old brother Tony. They visited 5 times before her death, and the police view was that Sophie always seemed happy and well. She wasn't. She was the subject of ongoing, repeated abuse. She died as a result of a ruptured intestine after blows to the abdomen. She had 170 bruises, and she was so disfigured by the attack that the judge refused to show the photos to the jury, which is a really unusual step. So it demonstrates just how bad the impact of those injuries must have been. Mum was convicted of manslaughter and cruelty, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, the boyfriend was convicted of manslaughter and cruelty, and he was given 15 years. Their convictions were both quashed on the 21st of December of 1993. And that was on the basis that it wasn't clear which of the two had struck the fatal blow. So they remained convicted of cruelty, but the manslaughter convictions were quashed. And next we have Tony Dales, who's aged 3, and her sister Samantha Dales, who was 5 months old. They lived with their mum, Ruth Dales, and her boyfriend, Glenn McPherson. Glenn was 26, and they lived in South Bank, which is near Middlesbrough in Cleveland. Now, in order to understand what happened with this family, we need to go back in time a little bit. So, in the 3 years before McPherson started a relationship with Mum, he'd had a relationship with 4 other women that he lived with. 3 of those suffered domestic violence as a result at his hands. The 4th, he was still domestically abusive and he caused criminal damage, but he didn't assault her. So he had a significant history of violence against children and women. And in February of 1990, so 2 years before the incident with Tony, McPherson was interviewed about causing an injury to Tony's sister Samantha, who at that time was 4 months old. And at the time, the paediatrician thought that it could be as a result of an assault, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to demonstrate whether it was, and if so, who had caused it. And McPherson denied that he had assaulted her. Now, a month later, she passed away, and it was deemed to be cot death, and no link was made between his behaviour and the death. However, there were still suspicions, and following that, injuries had been noted to Tony by staff at the Under 5 centre that she went to. Neighbours reported concerns and said that Tony was being treated with scorn. Nursery staff noted that Tony will stand alone and cry, puts her face down in her hands and paces backwards and forwards. And that nursery, which worked with many children at risk, so this wasn't an unusual thing for them to be dealing with, were afraid to alienate the parents by challenging the practices. So they would rather have been present in Tony's life and be a bit of a safeguard than completely alienate the parents, and they take Tony out of the nursery and then she's not seen by anybody. Now, whilst Macpherson was on probation for a separate offence, a violence offence, there were 9 recorded incidents of violence against this mother and Tony. 9. And of course, we know that in most domestic abuse situations, what's reported is only literally the tip of the iceberg. And then in February of 1992, Tony died from head injuries. And it was found that this was caused by being repeatedly, the term used was battered, and then thrown at a wall by Macpherson, which caused a fracture to a skull. Now, he was convicted of murder and given life in prison. And then after the event, there was an inquiry into kind of professionals' involvement with the family. And it was concluded that there was failure by social services, health, the police, education and the probation service. There was no communication between the various agencies, which meant that there was no way to identify patterns in Tony's short, tormented life. And the inquiry concluded that neighbours should be treated as respectfully as any other referring agency. So in this case they weren't. They were made to feel as though their concerns about Tony were unfounded and not worth much. It was found that there was a lack of professional challenge, that things were too informal, and that decisions weren't properly documented. But one of the biggest things was that Macpherson's previous convictions and previous police history weren't available to the other professional agencies that were working with the family. And without that information, you can't put the jigsaw pieces together and understand what the risks are to the child. Just 3 more cases to go. So this one is Leanne White, and she died in 1992. She lived in Nottinghamshire, and when she was 3 years old, she was essentially beaten to death by her stepfather. And that was in November of 1992. Her stepfather was Colin Sleet, who was 29 at the time, and her mum was Tina White, who was 22. Now, they treated Leanne appallingly. I don't think there's any other description for it. They made her sleep on the floor. Children's services had been notified by neighbours and by the grandparents about the abuse that was being suffered by Leanne at her mother's hands and the hands of her stepfather. And these reports were over a 6-month period before Leanne tragically ended up suffering what can only be described as a horrendous set of injuries. So she had 107 external injuries, internal bleeding, which was actually the cause of death, repeated blows to the stomach, Colin Sleat and the mum were tried at Nottingham Crown Court, and Sleat was convicted of murder and jailed for life. Mum was convicted of manslaughter and jailed for a period of 10 years. And the judge in this case was Mr. Justice Tudor Evans. And when he adjourned for sentencing after the trial, he said, "What is described in this report is appalling. I think in a case like this there should be no sweeping under the carpet. The report, details of which have been leaked, says the failure of social services staff to fully investigate the facts and their failure to report the matter to the police is at the heart of this tragic incident. A thorough investigation of the facts that were reported in the referrals concerning Leanne was not undertaken." So I think that's fair to say. 6-month period of repeated allegations. You've got grandparents who adored this little girl and wanted the best for her, and who were ignored. Neighbours corroborating those allegations, and yet nothing was done. The inquiry that was undertaken after the incident concluded that Leanne's death could have been prevented if Children's Services had responded properly to reports from Leanne's grandmother and neighbours that she was at risk. One of the reasons that led to the investigation not being an effective one by Children's Services was that they spelt Colin Sleat's name wrong. They also failed to record his date of birth correctly, and those two things combined led to problems in checking his police and probation records. So we have checks in place. Those checks and balances mean that when allegations are received, we do contact the police and we get information about any person who's living in the household with the child's background. But those checks are only as useful as the information that we put into the systems. So if we get the name wrong and we get the date of birth wrong, well then the right information isn't going to show up. Another serious omission was the failure to record the name of the social worker who made the first visit to a home in June of 1992. And it concluded that the social workers had not made any systematic record of information that they'd gathered. And that meant that there was no clear picture of Leanne, her family situation, the environment that she was growing up in, we just didn't have a clear understanding of what was happening. And it also concluded that the different complaints by people, the one from maternal grandmother Mary White, the ones from the neighbours, they were viewed in what it describes as splendid isolation. So nobody really pulling out themes and patterns about what those reports were showing. There were 3 contacts with children's social care by July 1992. And because of that, there should have been a far fuller investigation. And the report says, I'm going to quote it here, work appears to have been unstructured and not geared to fully investigate the concerns about Leanne, which by this time we feel ought to have been sufficient for a primary care discussion to have been called, if not a case conference. Initial home visits took place in June, and subsequent visits then took place, but the social workers didn't examine Leanne to check if she had any bruises or injuries. And so how can they have formed an opinion about whether Leanne was suffering any injuries? The social workers in the case didn't take the names of the neighbours who made the reports. And when you look at all of those errors together, nobody ever thought that the circumstances were serious enough for the matter to be referred to the police. And that could have been the difference between Leanne surviving and not. The report recommended that 28 changes be made to the handling of child abuse allegations. And Nottinghamshire's Social Services Director David White stated after the inquiry report was released that I do not have the power to order a public inquiry, but I will write to the appropriate minister and ask for an inquiry to take place. So at that stage even he recognised the serious shortcomings that had been uncovered. This case is probably the most tragic one that we've looked at so far, and so I'll give a trigger warning at this point. It does deal with postnatal depression and postnatal psychosis, so if that's something that's going to cause you any problems, then maybe skip over this particular case. So Mia Gabelli was born on the 6th of May of 1992 to her mum Christine Gabelli, and they lived in Lambeth. Now, mum had had 2 previous children taken into care because there had been an incident where, in the throes of postnatal psychosis, she'd attempted to throw one of the children from a 3rd floor balcony. So when the GP found out that mum was pregnant, which was quite late on in her pregnancy, I think she was 22 weeks pregnant, he did make a referral to children's social care, but that wasn't followed up at that stage. And then in that referral he referenced mum's history of psychiatric admissions, drug use and heavy drinking, which are not a great mixture. But But in January of 1992, the antenatal unit at King's College became a little bit concerned because Mum had made some concerning statements about her older children. And they asked the hospital-based social workers to pull together some background information about the family. And they didn't find it. They didn't find the file about a previous incidents. So that was a bit of an issue in being able to identify what the risks are if you're not aware of something that was so significant in Mum's past. Now, the referral though at that point had been received from the midwifery team at King's College, so something needed to be done. So as well as that initial kind of delving into the history, there was then a decision to be made who deals with the investigation. Is it the social work team at the hospital, or is it the area team from where Mum lives? And because they were fighting about that, they didn't undertake a pre-birth assessment of Mum. This case is just kind of error after error, unfortunately. So eventually it was decided that Area 8 would take responsibility for the case. But that was really late in the day in the pregnancy, and they arranged a case conference for a week before Mum gave birth. But the social worker only got the papers 30 minutes before the case conference, so she didn't have time to read the papers. And so, based on a kind of very broad overview of the risks in the case, she agreed a plan of the mum being admitted to a mother and baby unit, receiving hormonal treatment for postnatal psychosis, and the child being subject to a child protection plan. The fallback was, if Mum didn't accept any of those terms, then the social worker would seek a care order from the courts prior to the baby being ready for discharge from hospital. And Mum did refuse, and she refused on the basis that her new partner had heard about a Harley Street specialist having this pioneering new treatment for postnatal psychosis. And the doctor was called Dr. Katharina Dalton. Now, this pioneering new treatment, it wasn't universally accepted in medical fields, and the hospital had some significant doubt about it. However, the baby was born on the 6th of May of 1992, and these progesterone injections were started, which was this new pioneering treatment, and they started on the 7th of May. And at the beginning, everything was going very well. So the treatment seemed to be working. Mum was assessed and was declared to be mentally well. She was allowed to take Mia home. But then the child protection plan just fell apart. Chani Kumar, who was a psychiatrist, had warned of a risk to the child and the need to monitor mum and baby. But the social workers who came to visit after the birth hadn't even really read the files. Even the allocated social worker still at that point, so a couple of weeks on from having 30 minutes notice of a case conference, she still hadn't been able to block out enough time between visits to read the file in full. So midwives and health visitors weren't aware of the full background. The social workers hadn't read the file in full, so nobody had a clear grasp of how serious the risks were in this case. And a case conference review was booked in for the 29th of June. And the plan was, Mum could keep the baby. She was doing really well. But Mum's partner had said that Mum was beginning to fret about the potential outcome of the case conference. She kept asking when it would be. She was absolutely convinced that they were going to remove Mia from her because of what had happened with previous children. And this treatment that she was on, it only worked if you were given the injections every 24 hours without fail. So, but May and June had been doing so well. And then on Sunday, the 28th of June, the district nurse wasn't able to attend to give Mum the injection. And since the birth, Mum had had 8 midwives that visited, 5 health workers, 6 social workers and 3 probation workers. But none of that helped because nobody could have predicted that the district nurse wouldn't be able to come and give that injection. And on the 29th of June at 7 a.m, Mia's mum drowned her. And why did that happen? It happened because she'd entered into a postnatal psychosis because her treatment hadn't been given in its strict regime that was required. And Mum was ordered to stay in a hospital secure unit after drowning Mia. And it was in just a few inches of water in the kitchen whilst her boyfriend had gone for a snooze. She pleaded guilty to infanticide, and Judge Lawrence Verney, the Recorder of London, ordered that she be detained until doctors considered that she was no longer a safety risk. And after that incident, the Lambeth inquiry took place into the care of Mia Gibelli, and it concluded that this case was blighted by a series of omissions, oversights, procrastinations and failures to communicate. And it made 27 recommendations to changes in procedures and practice. And that included, but obviously isn't limited to, cross-referencing patient files between different agencies. All agencies being required to attend pre-birth conferences in relation to high-risk babies. That staff have got to read case files. And must call case conferences urgently. And in this case, diary clashes had seen the date for the case conference slip backwards by 8 weeks. Now, in the lifespan of a baby, that's 8 weeks is a lot. it concluded that crucial information must be shared immediately between social workers, doctors, health visitors and any other relevant agencies. Now, the key recommendations were all implemented, and because of the glaring oversights in this case, extra staff were allocated to childcare work. And the junior health minister stated it does defy belief that there should have been such a poor level of communication, such a wholly inadequate response, given the nature of the tragedy which was all too likely to occur under these circumstances. And the inquiry concluded that not all such tragedies can be prevented. Children will continue to die from inflicted injuries, even in circumstances where social workers are involved. Because as a society, we value parents' rights so highly that we weigh them in against the children's rights and the children's lives. And I'm going to leave it there, guys. So we've got to 1992, and next time we'll come back and we'll look at some more cases moving on from that period. As we get into the more recent cases, we get more kind of information that's available, more photographs, and things get even more interesting in terms of what we can learn from these absolutely horrendous tragedies. And I think you'll probably all agree the case of Mia Gabelli is literally the most heartbreaking case to even conceive of. But her little life, it meant something. And if what happened to her results in changes that mean that other mums with babies who have postnatal depression and postnatal psychosis can be supported and treated and the risks managed properly, so tragedies like this don't happen, then her life won't have been in vain. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to watch this to the end. You know, we're an hour and 18 minutes in now, so it's not been a short one. But these cases are just, there's so many of them and they're so interesting. I could literally sit here and do this all day. I'm not sure my voice would last all day, but I could literally sit here and do this all day. Thank you everyone that's watched. If I can do a shameless plug, if you could all please like the video, subscribe to the channel, that really helps to get the message out there to more people. And if you feel so inclined, if you can share the video as well out on your social networks, that means that obviously more people will see it and we can educate the world more about safeguarding our precious little children. Stay safe everyone, and I'll see you next time. And effing F-bombs.